14-year-old smiled during trial for killing his best friend until the judge destroys his ego. 14-year-old Aiden Fucci sat in the back of a St. Johns County Sheriff's Patrol car on the afternoon of May 9, 2021, held up a peace sign and took a selfie. The caption he posted to Snapchat read, "Hey guys, has anybody seen Tristan lately?" The misspelling was the only careless thing about it. At that very moment, search parties were combing every inch of the Durbin Crossing neighborhood, calling out the name of a missing 13-year-old cheerleader. Neighbors walked in their Sunday best, having abandoned Mother's Day brunches to join the hunt. Deputies flew helicopters overhead. Parents clutched their own children a little tighter. And somewhere in the back of that patrol car, Aiden Fucci smiled at his phone screen, knowing exactly where Tristan Bailey was. He knew because he had stabbed her 114 times and left her body in the woods less than half a mile from his bedroom window. Stories like this remind us why we must pay attention to the warning signs hiding in plain sight. If you believe in justice for innocent victims and accountability for those who commit unspeakable acts, subscribe now and join this community. Your voice matters here. The videos Fucci posted that afternoon would later be played in a packed courtroom, and every person who watched them would feel the same cold realization settle into their bones. This was not a frightened teenager caught up in something beyond his understanding. This was not a young man paralyzed by shock or denial. In one clip, Fucci's voice rang out with unmistakable amusement as he announced to his Snapchat followers, "We're having fun in a feeding cop car." He laughed. He joked. He performed for an audience while a community tore itself apart searching for a girl whose blood was still drying on the white Nike sneakers hidden in his closet. The disconnect between his behavior and the horror he had committed was so profound that even seasoned investigators would later describe it as one of the most disturbing things they had ever witnessed in their careers. Durbin Crossing was not the kind of place where things like this happened. Nestled in St. Johns County, just south of Jacksonville, Florida, it represented everything families moved to the suburbs to find. The streets curved gently past manicured lawns and two-story homes with three-car garages. Children rode their bikes to the community pool. Neighbors waved from their driveways. The county consistently ranked among the safest in Florida, with violent crime rates well below state and national averages. Parents chose this neighborhood specifically because it felt protected, insulated from the dangers that plagued other communities. The Durbin Crossing North Amenity Center hosted Food Truck Fridays and community events where families gathered under string lights. It was, by every measure, an idyllic American suburb, the kind of place where the worst thing that could happen was a package stolen from a porch. But on the morning of May 9, 2021, that illusion shattered completely. The Bailey family had been preparing for a special day. Stacy Bailey, the matriarch of what they lovingly called the Bailey Seven, expected to wake up to her 5 children gathering in the kitchen to celebrate her. Mother's Day had always been sacred in their household, a time when the family came together to honor the woman who held them all together. The youngest of those 5 children was Tristan, a 13-year-old 7th grader whose energy filled every room she entered. She was supposed to be asleep in her bedroom. She was supposed to come bounding down the stairs with that infectious smile her family knew so well. Instead, when her sister Sophia went to wake her, the room was empty. The bed had been slept in, but Tristan was gone. At first, the family searched the house, calling her name through the hallways and checking every room. Perhaps she had fallen asleep on the couch. Perhaps she was already outside. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, the worry transformed into something sharper. Stacy Bailey picked up the phone and dialed 911 at approximately 10 o'clock that morning. Her voice carried the controlled panic of a mother who already sensed something was terribly wrong. She told the dispatcher that her daughter was 5 feet 4 inches tall, approximately 130 pounds, and attended Patriot Oaks Academy. She explained that Tristan had been last seen by a sibling around midnight, that her cell phone went straight to voicemail, and that location sharing had been turned off. Within the hour, the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office issued a Florida missing child alert. The notification spread across phones throughout the region, and the response was immediate. Families abandoned their holiday plans. Residents formed search parties and fanned out through the neighborhood, walking the trails and wooded areas that teenagers were known to frequent. Deputies knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen the missing girl. The community transformed into a single organism focused on one desperate goal: finding Tristan Bailey before something terrible happened. What none of them knew was that something terrible had already happened, and the boy responsible was walking among them, offering to help show deputies where he had last seen his classmate alive. The search would continue for hours, hope fading with every passing minute, until a resident jogging near a retention pond at the end of Saddlestone Drive stumbled upon a sight that would haunt this community forever. The man had been jogging his usual route through the wooded area at the southern edge of the neighborhood, following the path that wound past the retention pond where rainwater collected after Florida's frequent storms. It was approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, and the May sun still hung above the tree line, casting long shadows through the Spanish moss that draped from ancient oaks. He noticed something in the underbrush that did not belong, a shape, a form that his mind initially refused to process, because processing it meant accepting something unthinkable. He stopped running, he stepped closer, and then he saw her, a young girl, fully clothed, lying motionless in the woods. Her body bore wounds so numerous, so savage, that the jogger would later struggle to describe what he witnessed without his voice breaking. He called 911 immediately, and within minutes, the quiet woods erupted with the wail of sirens. Deputies arrived to find a crime scene that veteran investigators would describe as among the most brutal they had ever encountered. The victim lay in a wooded area adjacent to a retention pond, approximately 3/10 of a mile from the home of the boy who had been so helpfully showing officers where he last saw her. Crime scene tape went up quickly, creating a perimeter that would remain in place for days as forensic teams methodically documented every inch of the area. By 8 o'clock that evening, the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office confirmed what the Bailey family had been dreading since morning. The body found in those woods belonged to 13-year-old Tristan Tyne Bailey. Mother's Day 2021 would forever be remembered as the day this community lost its innocence. The medical examiner's preliminary findings painted a picture of violence so extreme that it defied comprehension. Tristan Bailey had been stabbed 114 times. The wounds covered her head, neck, shoulders, arms, hands, and back. 49 of those wounds were classified as defensive, meaning she had fought desperately for her life, raising her hands and arms to shield herself from the relentless assault. The tip of the murder weapon, a Buck brand folding knife, had broken off during the attack with such force that it became lodged in her scalp. Investigators recovered the knife itself from the retention pond nearby, its blade bent and damaged from the ferocity of what it had been used to do. On the inside of Tristan's left ankle, someone had written the word karma in blue ink. On her right ankle, a crude smiley face had been drawn. To this day, no one knows who wrote those words or what they were meant to signify. As forensic technicians worked through the night, photographing evidence and collecting samples, investigators were already piecing together a timeline. They knew that Tristan had been seen with a classmate in the hours before her disappearance. Surveillance footage from the Durbin Crossing North Amenity Center, captured at 1:14 in the morning, showed two figures walking north along North Durbin Parkway. One was Tristan Bailey, recognizable by her clothing and distinctive walk. The other was a 14-year-old boy named Aiden Fucci, an 8th grader who attended the same school and lived in the same neighborhood. 30 minutes later, at 1:45 a.m., a home surveillance camera on Saddlestone Drive recorded the same two teenagers walking together, still side by side, heading in the direction of the wooded area where Tristan's body would later be found. But it was the footage captured at 3:27 a.m. that told investigators everything they needed to know. The same home camera recorded a single figure moving quickly in the opposite direction. The person was alone. They were carrying a pair of white shoes in their arms rather than wearing them on their feet. The gait, the build, the clothing all matched Aiden Fucci. Somewhere in the span of less than 2 hours, Tristan Bailey had vanished from existence, and the boy who had been walking beside her had emerged from those woods alone, clutching sneakers sneakers he apparently did not want to leave footprints with. Additional surveillance from the Fucci residence showed Aiden entering his home at approximately 3:30 in the morning. For investigators, the video evidence created an almost airtight timeline. The question was no longer whether something had happened between those two teenagers in those woods. The question was what exactly had occurred and whether the 14-year-old boy would tell them the truth. The answer to that question would prove more disturbing than anyone anticipated. When deputies first approached Aiden Fucci on the afternoon of May 9th, he presented himself as a cooperative witness eager to help find his missing classmate. He agreed to show officers the route he and Tristan had walked the night before. He climbed into the back of a patrol car willingly, seemingly unbothered by the gravity of the situation unfolding around him. His parents, Crystal Smith and Jason Fucci, accompanied him to the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office for questioning. For several hours, Aiden maintained the posture of someone with nothing to hide, but his story had holes, significant holes, and as investigators pressed for details, those holes began to widen into chasms that would eventually swallow him whole. The distance between the friend's house where Aiden claimed he and Tristan had parted ways and his own home was approximately 1.4 miles. A reasonable walking pace would cover that distance in less than 30 minutes. Yet Aiden claimed he arrived home between 3 o'clock and 3:30 in the morning, more than 2 hours after leaving their mutual friend's residence. When deputies pointed out this discrepancy, the cooperative teenager's demeanor began to shift. Aiden changed his story. He admitted that Tristan had not turned onto her street as he initially claimed. They had continued walking together along North Durban Parkway, he said, past Leith Hall Drive and deeper into the neighborhood. Then came an accusation that investigators immediately recognized as an attempt to shift blame onto the victim. Aiden claimed that Tristan had grabbed his private parts without consent, which made him angry. He said he pushed her forcefully, causing her to fall and strike her head on the ground. He claimed he was dizzy from smoking marijuana earlier that evening and could not remember if he saw her get up. He suggested she might be with a drug dealer in his 20s that she supposedly communicated with through Snapchat. He offered alternative theories for her disappearance, pointing fingers in every direction except toward himself. The detectives listening to this account knew they were being lied to. A girl with 114 stab wounds had not died from hitting her head after being pushed. The defensive wounds covering her hands and arms told the story of someone who had fought for her life against a relentless attacker, not someone who had fallen during an argument. When confronted with the impossibility of his explanation, Aiden Fucci invoked his right to remain silent and requested an attorney. The cooperative witness had transformed into a suspect in the span of a single interview. Deputies returned him to the North Amenities Center where his parents waited and began preparing the paperwork for a search warrant that would blow the case wide open. Shortly before 9 o'clock that Sunday evening, approximately 1 hour after Sheriff Robert Hardwick announced publicly that a body had been found, Aiden sat in an interrogation room at the sheriff's office with his mother, Crystal Smith. Surveillance cameras recorded every moment of what transpired inside that room. When his parents informed him that Tristan was dead and that he was the last person seen with her alive, Aiden Fucci responded with 5 words that would echo through courtrooms for years to come. He looked at his parents and asked flatly, "So, how is that my problem?" There was no shock in his voice, no grief, no confusion, just cold, calculated detachment from the horror he had inflicted on a 13-year-old girl who had trusted him enough to sneak out of her house in the middle of the night. The surveillance footage from that interrogation room would reveal even more damning behavior. Crystal Smith, rather than demanding answers from her son or expressing horror at the situation, appeared to coach him. She advised him to find his story and stick with it. At one point, when discussing his clothing from the previous night, she whispered the word blood to him, as if reminding him that certain items needed explanation. She attempted to convince him that he had been wearing khaki pants rather than the blue jeans investigators were asking about. The mother of a murder suspect was not seeking truth. She was helping construct a cover story. Her actions that night would eventually result in her own criminal charges, adding another layer of betrayal to an already devastating case. Around midnight, armed with a search warrant, investigators descended on the Fucci residence on Castledale Court. What they they found inside Aiden's bedroom confirmed every suspicion they had developed throughout that terrible day. A pair of white Nike sneakers sat in his room stained with blood. A gray hooded sweatshirt bore similar stains. A t-shirt that should have been in a laundry hamper instead sat crumpled with dark spots that would later test positive for Tristan Bailey's DNA. Wet blue jeans had been placed in a laundry basket, still damp from what appeared to be an attempt to wash away evidence. In the bathroom, investigators found blood in the sink drain, traces of whatever desperate cleaning had occurred in the hours after the murder. But the most damning discovery waited in Aiden's closet: an empty knife sheath designs D for a Buck brand folding knife sat among his belongings. The sheath matched precisely with the murder weapon recovered from the retention pond near Tristan's body. Investigators also found a notebook containing drawings that depicted violence and mutilation, images that suggested the darkness inside this 14-year-old boy had been festering for far longer than anyone realized. The physical evidence was overwhelming: blood, DNA, the murder weapon, surveillance footage, and a story that changed with every telling. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on May 10, 2021, Aiden Fucci was formally arrested and booked on charges of second-degree murder in the death of Tristan Bailey. The community woke that Monday morning to news that transformed their grief into something approaching disbelief. The killer was not some stranger who had wandered into their safe neighborhood. He was not an adult predator who had stalked a vulnerable child. He was a 14-year-old boy who had grown up on these same streets, attended the same school, and walked the same paths as every other teenager in Durban Crossing. He was someone's son, someone's classmate, someone's neighbor, and now he was a confessed killer whose face would be broadcast across every news station in America. For the Bailey family, the arrest brought no comfort. Their daughter was still gone, and understanding why this had happened would require confronting a truth far more disturbing than anyone was prepared to accept. Tristan Tyne Bailey came into this world on January 18, 2008 in Singapore, where her family was living at the time. She was the youngest of 5 children born to Forrest and Stacy Bailey, a position that earned her the affectionate nickname Baby Bailey among her siblings. The family would eventually settle in St. Johns County, Florida, where Tristan would spend the formative years of her childhood surrounded by the people who loved her most. Her older siblings, Brittany, Alexis, Sophia, and Tegan, formed a protective circle around their youngest sister, each developing their own unique bond with the girl whose energy seemed inexhaustible. Together, they called themselves the Bailey Seven, a name that reflected not just their number but their unbreakable connection as a family unit. That connection would be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. Those who knew Tristan described her as a natural performer, someone whose presence commanded attention not through force, but through sheer magnetic joy. She had a smile that seemed to illuminate whatever space she occupied, a laugh that was impossible not to return, and an enthusiasm for life that made everyone around her feel more alive. At Patriot Oaks Academy, the K-8 charter school she attended in St. Johns County, Tristan stood out as both a popular student and a fierce competitor. She was in 7th grade, navigating the complex social landscape of middle school with the same determination she brought to everything else in her life. Her teachers would later describe her as engaged, curious, and kind, the sort of student who made their jobs feel meaningful. But it was cheerleading that truly captured Tristan's heart and showcased her remarkable spirit. She was not a casual participant in the sport. She was devoted to it with an intensity that pushed her to excel at the highest levels. Tristan cheered for 3 separate teams simultaneously, including the Patriot Oaks Chargers and a competitive squad called Infinity All-Stars. Just weeks before her death, she had traveled to Orlando with Infinity All-Stars to compete in an ESPN cheerleading competition. Her team won first place, and the jacket she wore during that victory would later be displayed at her memorial service as a symbol of everything she had accomplished in her 13 short years. The dedication required to compete at that level, the early morning practices and weekend tournaments, spoke to a work ethic that belied her young age. Her mother, Stacy, would later reflect on the daughter she lost with words that captured both Tristan's essence and understand the magnitude of what was taken. She was just a powerful child that was able to give a lot to so many, Stacy said. That power manifested not in dominance but in generosity, in Tristan's remarkable ability to see the best in people and make them feel valued. Friends described her as someone who went out of her way to include those who felt left out, who befriended the kids others overlooked, who stood up for people who could not stand up for themselves. She had what her loved ones called a heart of gold, a phrase that might sound cliché until you heard the specific examples of her kindness that backed it up. Within the Bailey family, Tristan occupied a special role as the connector, the one whose relationships with each sibling added something unique to the family dynamic. Despite a 16-year age gap, she and her oldest sister Brittany had developed a friendship that transcended the typical sibling relationship. They were kindred spirits who understood each other on a level that age difference could not diminish. With Alexis, Tristan shared a deep love for animals, spending hours together caring for pets and dreaming about futures that involved helping creatures in need. Alexis had become almost a second mother to her youngest sister, protective and nurturing in equal measure. Brother Tegan brought out what the family called Tristan's serious side, engaging her in conversations about goals and aspirations that revealed a maturity beyond her years. The bond between Tristan and her mother was perhaps the most profound of all. Stacy and her youngest daughter had developed a connection forged through countless cheerleading weekends, road trips to competitions, and late-night conversations about life and dreams and everything in between. Tristan was Stacy's constant companion during those long tournament days, and the memories they created together formed a treasure that no amount of time could diminish. "Always and forever my cheerleader and my sweet baby girl," Stacy would later say through tears, capturing in a single phrase the depth of what she had lost. Tristan had been more than a daughter. She had been a confidant, a source of joy, and a reminder of everything beautiful about being a mother. What made Tristan's death so particularly devastating to those who knew her was the cruel irony of her nature. She was, by all accounts, someone who saw good in everyone, who gave people the benefit of the doubt even when they did not deserve it. She befriended those who struggled to make friends. She trusted those who had not earned her trust. "I did not know that I needed to teach Tristan to be afraid of the evil in her own school," her mother would later tell a courtroom, "to be cautious and fearful of the people you think are your friends." Tristan's openness, her willingness to see humanity in everyone, may have been the very quality that made her vulnerable to the monster hiding behind a classmate's face. The celebration of life held for Tristan Bailey drew hundreds of mourners to Celebration Church in Jacksonville, transforming grief into a collective act of remembrance. Her siblings took turns at the microphone, each sharing memories that painted a portrait of a girl whose impact far exceeded her 13 years. Her brother Tegan spoke of the lessons she had taught him, of her determination and drive that inspired him to reach his own goals. "The world could be made much brighter with just one smile," he said, channeling the wisdom his baby sister had imparted. "Always be proud of yourself and never hide yourself. No matter who is watching, go and be silly. Go enjoy life." Her sisters recalled her infectious energy, her loyalty, her way of making even the most ordinary moments feel special. The aqua jacket from her ESPN cheerleading victory stood on display, a testament to everything she had achieved and everything she would never have the chance to become. Throughout St. Johns County, the community responded to Tristan's death with an outpouring of support that would continue for years. Aqua ribbons and bows appeared on mailboxes and front porches throughout Durban Crossing, the color chosen because it had been Tristan's favorite. Signs bearing her name lined the streets she had walked. Families who had never met the Baileys dropped off meals and offered whatever help they could provide. The neighborhood that had searched so desperately for Tristan on Mother's Day now united in grief, determined to honor her memory even as they struggled to comprehend how such violence could have erupted in their midst. For many parents, the tragedy forced uncomfortable conversations with their own children about safety, about trust, and about the reality that danger could wear a familiar face. Tristan's relationship with her killer was not one of deep friendship or romantic entanglement. They were classmates at Patriot Oaks Academy, acquaintances who moved in overlapping social circles within the Durbin Crossing neighborhood. They knew the same people, attended the same school events, and lived less than half a mile apart. On the night of May 8, 2021, a mutual friend had invited both of them to hang out at his house. It was the kind of casual teenage gathering that happens in suburbs across America every weekend, kids congregating after dark to talk and laugh and escape the watchful eyes of parents. Tristan had snuck out of her house to attend, something her family said she had never done before. She had no way of knowing that accepting that invitation would cost her everything. The boy she walked into those woods with presented a very different face to the world than the one he revealed in the darkness. Aiden. Sean Fucci was 14 years old, an 8th grader at the same school Tristan attended. He lived with his mother, Crystal Smith, in a home on Castledale Court that backed up to the same network of wooded paths and retention ponds where Tristan's body would be discovered. From the outside, he appeared to be a typical suburban teenager navigating the awkward transition from childhood to adolescence. He played video games, he had friends, he posted on social media like every other kid his age. Neighbors who encountered him would not have described anything overtly alarming about his behavior. He was simply one more face in a neighborhood full of young people growing up in what everyone assumed was a safe and nurturing environment. But appearances in the Fucci household masked a more complicated reality. Aiden had been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, a condition that his defense attorneys would later cite as a contributing factor to his behavior. His family history included mental illness, and court documents would eventually reveal allegations of physical abuse by a stepfather. His mother, Crystal Smith, had her own struggles that would become painfully apparent in the aftermath of the murder. Defense attorneys would paint a picture of a boy failed by the systems meant to protect him, a child whose emotional needs went unmet during crucial developmental years. Whether these factors explained or merely contextualized what Aiden Fucci became remains a question that divides those who followed the case closely. What the surface normalcy concealed was a darkness that had been building for years, visible to those who knew where to look but dismissed by those who should have intervened. Aiden Fucci was not a boy who snapped without warning. He was a boy who had been warning everyone around him for months, perhaps years, about exactly what he was capable of doing. The signs were there in his words, in his drawings, in his behavior toward the people closest to him. Friends and girlfriends would later tell investigators about conversations that should have raised alarms, about threats that were laughed off as teenage edginess, about a fascination with violence that went far beyond normal adolescent boundary testing. His ex-girlfriend would provide some of the most chilling testimony about the boy behind the mask. She described a relationship marked by disturbing behavior that she initially dismissed as dark humor shared between teenagers who considered themselves different from their peers. Aiden talked about death constantly, she said. He talked about killing constantly. He described in detail what it would feel like to take someone's life, how satisfying it would be to watch the light leave their eyes. He carried a knife with him whenever he was outside of school, treating it like a talisman rather than a tool. On multiple occasions, he had put that knife to her throat and pretended to slit it while she laughed nervously, unsure whether to take the threat seriously. The girlfriend's account grew more disturbing with each detail she shared. Aiden had 2 knives that he treated with particular affection, giving them nicknames as though they were pets or companions rather than weapons. He called them Picker and Poker, names that suggested he had thought carefully about their different purposes. During their relationship, which lasted from January to the spring of 2021, he had made statements that she initially interpreted as dark humor but would later recognize as confessions of intent. He told her he was going to kill someone soon. He said she should expect it to happen within the month. He described how he would do it: find someone walking alone at night, drag them into the woods, and stab them. She listened to these declarations and laughed them off because he was just a kid. They were all just kids. Nobody actually me's. And the terrible things they said. But Aiden meant every word. Investigators would later uncover a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond his relationship with this one girlfriend. Multiple friends told deputies that Fucci talked about death and killing constantly, that it seemed to be his favorite topic of conversation. He drew pictures of mutilated bodies in notebooks, images so graphic that classmates who saw them felt uncomfortable but said nothing to adults. He watched videos online depicting real violence, not the fictional gore of horror movies but actual footage of people being hurt and killed. He practiced stabbing motions with his knife, perfecting the technique he would eventually use on Tristan Bailey. One friend recalled him saying that slitting someone's throat would be satisfying, that he wanted to know what it felt like. These were not idle fantasies whispered in private moments. These were declarations made openly to peers who convinced themselves that no 14-year-old could possibly be serious. Clinical psychologist Dr. Gregory Pritchard would later testify about the significance of these behaviors, describing what he observed as an unusual fascination with gore and violence that went far beyond typical adolescent boundary testing. Teenagers often explore dark themes in their media consumption and conversations, pushing against societal taboos as part of their identity formation. What distinguished Aiden Fucci was the specificity of his fantasies, the consistency of his statements over time, and the way his interest in violence seemed to intensify rather than fade. Dr. Pritchard described interviewing Fucci's ex-girlfriend and learning that Aiden had told her how easy it would be to kill her while she slept. This was not abstract musing about mortality. This was a boy lying next to someone he claimed to care about and imagining ending her life. The clinical term for what Pritchard observed was affective detachment, an emotional disconnection from other people's pain that, when combined with violent fantasies, points toward antisocial or psychopathic traits. The tragedy of these warning signs was that they existed in plain sight, yet went unheeded by every adult who might have intervened. Friends heard the threats and dismissed them. Parents remained unaware of what their children discussed when unsupervised. Teachers and school administrators saw nothing that triggered formal concern. The systems designed to identify troubled youth and connect them with mental health resources failed completely in the case of Aiden Fucci. He slipped through every crack, his escalating behavior invisible to those who possessed the authority to act. By the time anyone took his statements seriously, Tristan Bailey was already dead, and the opportunity for intervention had passed forever. In the aftermath, State Attorney R.J. Larizza would issue a pointed warning to parents everywhere. You need to know what your kids are doing and what they are saying, because while we might not be able to stop these brutal and vicious murders from happening, we ought to at least try. The night of May 8, 2021 began unremarkably for everyone involved. A mutual friend of both Tristan and Aiden had invited several classmates to hang out at his house after dark. The gathering was casual, the kind of low-key socializing that teenagers engage in when school is out and summer approaches. Tristan made the decision to sneak out of her house, slipping away sometime after her family had gone to sleep. It was apparently the first time she had ever done such a thing, a single act of adolescent rebellion that would prove fatal. She and Aiden ended up at the friend's house together, spending hours in the company of their peers before leaving around 1 o'clock in the morning. Surveillance footage captured them walking north along North Durban Parkway at 1:14 a.m., two figures moving through the darkness of a sleeping neighborhood. 30 minutes later, another camera recorded them still together on Saddlestone Drive, heading toward the wooded area where Tristan would take her last breaths. What transpired in those woods between 1:45 and 3:27 in the morning may never be fully known, but the physical evidence tells a story of sustained, savage violence. Tristan fought for her life. She raised her hands to block the blade. She tried to run, but Aiden Fucci was relentless, stabbing her again and again until his knife broke from the force of his assault. When it was over, he left her body in the underbrush and walked home carrying his blood-soaked sneakers. He arrived at his house around 3:30 a.m., and, according to surveillance footage, his mother helped him begin the process of concealing what he had done. The investigation that followed would expose not only the brutality of the crime itself, but the web of complicity and denial that surrounded its perpetrator. Sergeant Kurt Hannon of the St. Johns County Sheriff's Office was assigned as the lead investigator on the case, and from the moment he began reviewing the evidence, the picture became devastatingly clear. The surveillance footage alone created a timeline that was nearly impossible to dispute. Two teenagers walking together at 1:14 a.m. The same two teenagers still together at 1:45 a.m., heading toward a wooded area. One teenager emerging alone at 3:27 a.m., moving quickly in the opposite direction, carrying shoes he did not want to leave prints with. The mathematics of murder had been captured in high definition by the very security cameras that residents had installed to keep their neighborhoods safe. What those cameras recorded was not an intruder from outside the community, but a killer who had grown up on these same streets. The sheriff's office moved with remarkable speed in the hours following the discovery of Tristan's body. By the time darkness fell on May 9th, investigators had already identified Aiden Fucci as their primary person of interest. His willingness to help search for Tristan, his offer to show deputies where he had last seen her, had initially appeared cooperative, but experienced detectives recognized the behavior for what it was: an attempt to control the narrative, to insert himself into the investigation, to appear helpful while actually monitoring what law enforcement knew. It was a tactic common among killers who believed themselves smarter than the people hunting them. Aiden Fucci had watched enough crime shows to think he understood how investigations worked. What he did not understand was that the evidence he left behind would speak louder than any story he could construct. The search warrant executed at the Fucci residence around midnight yielded a forensic goldmine. Investigators documented everything they found with meticulous precision, creating a chain of evidence that would prove unbreakable in court. The white Nike sneakers recovered from Aiden's bedroom were soaked with blood that DNA analysis would confirm belonged to Tristan Bailey. The gray hooded sweatshirt bore similar stains, as did the t-shirt crumpled nearby. In the bathroom, luminol testing revealed traces of blood in the sink drain, evidence of a hasty cleanup that had failed to eliminate all biological material. The wet blue jeans in the laundry basket told their own story of attempted concealment. Crystal Smith's efforts to wash away the evidence had been captured on the home's own surveillance system, footage that would eventually lead to her arrest on tampering charges. The murder weapon itself provided some of the most compelling evidence in the case. The Buck brand folding knife recovered from the retention pond near Tristan's body showed clear signs of the violence it had inflicted. The blade was bent, damaged from the force of over 100 stab wounds. More significantly, the tip of the knife was missing, broken off during the assault. When the medical examiner conducted Tristan's autopsy, that missing knife tip was discovered embedded in her scalp, lodged there by the sheer brutality of the attack. The sheath found in Aiden's bedroom matched the recovered knife precisely, creating a direct link between the weapon and its owner. Investigators also found notebooks containing drawings that depicted violence and death, images that corroborated what friends and girlfriends had reported about Aiden's obsessions. Digital evidence added another layer to an already overwhelming case. Forensic analysts recovered Aiden's social media activity, including the Snapchat posts he had made while sitting in the back of a patrol car. The selfie with the peace sign and the mocking caption about Tristan's whereabouts demonstrated a level of callousness that shocked even veteran investigators. Additional Snapchat messages revealed that Aiden had written shortly after the killing, asking if anyone knew girls who need their guts pulled out. The casual reference to evisceration, posted while Tristan's body lay undiscovered in the woods, suggested that the murder had not satisfied whatever dark urge drove him. If anything, it seemed to have emboldened him. Investigators also obtained records of prior messages in which Aiden had told friends about his desire to kill, creating a documented trail of premeditation. The interviews conducted with Aiden's peers painted a consistent picture of a teenager who had broadcast his intentions to anyone willing to listen. Friend after friend told investigators the same story. Aiden talked about killing all the time. He described how he would do it. He said it would happen soon. One friend recalled the specific language Aiden used. He wanted to slit someone's throat because he thought thought it would be satisfying. Another remembered seeing him practice stabbing motions with his knife, rehearsing the movements that would eventually end Tristan's life. A girlfriend recounted the nights he had held a blade to her neck, the times he had described killing her in her sleep. Each interview added another piece to a mosaic of premeditation that the prosecution would use to devastating effect. The evidence of planning was so substantial that prosecutors quickly moved to upgrade the charges. On May 25, 2021, just over 2 weeks after Tristan's murder, State Attorney R.J. Larizza announced that Aiden Fucci would be charged with first-degree premeditated murder and tried as an adult. The decision meant that if convicted, the 14-year-old could face life in prison. Larizza explained the reasoning during a press conference that drew national attention. The sheer number of stab wounds, he said, demonstrated premeditation beyond any reasonable doubt. 114 separate acts of violence against a defenseless 13-year-old girl could not be explained as a moment of passion or a reaction to provocation. This was planned, this was deliberate, and this demanded the most serious consequences the justice system could impose. The medical examiner's full report, when it was finally released, provided the clinical documentation of what Tristan Bailey had endured in her final moments. Dr. James Fulcher, chief medical examiner for Volusia County, conducted the autopsy and cataloged every wound with the detached precision required by his profession. 114 stab or cutting wounds covered Tristan's body, concentrated on her head, neck, shoulders, arms, hands, and back. The distribution of these wounds told a story of relentless assault from which there was no escape. 49 of the injuries were classified as defensive wounds, meaning Tristan had fought desperately against her attacker. She had raised her hands to block the blade. She had tried to shield her face and head. She had struggled with every ounce of strength her 13-year-old body possessed. None of it was enough to save her. The defensive wounds on Tristan's hands and arms revealed the duration of her suffering. These were not injuries sustained in a brief, chaotic struggle. They accumulated over time as she repeatedly attempted to protect herself from a blade that kept coming. The medical examiner noted wounds of varying depths and angles, suggesting movement and repositioning as the attack progressed. Some cuts were shallow, glancing blows that occurred as Tristan twisted away from the knife. Others penetrated deep into tissue, evidence of strikes that found their mark despite her efforts. The 49 defensive injuries meant that Tristan had remained conscious and fighting through at least that many separate attacks. She knew what was happening to her. She felt every cut, and she refused to stop resisting even when resistance was futile. The knife tip lodged in Tristan's scalp became one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence in the case. During the autopsy, Dr. Fulcher discovered the metal fragment embedded in bone, broken off with such force that it had become permanently fixed in place. This fragment matched precisely with the damaged buck knife recovered from the retention pond, creating an unbreakable forensic link between the weapon and the victim. The break had occurred because the blade encountered resistance it could not overcome, likely skull bone that refused to yield. The violence required to snap a knife tip in this manner was extraordinary. It spoke to a frenzy of attack that went far beyond anything necessary to cause death, suggesting rage or compulsion that could not be satisfied even after life had clearly ended. Florida Department of Law Enforcement analysts processed every piece of physical evidence with exhaustive thoroughness. DNA profiles extracted from the blood on Aiden's clothing matched Tristan Bailey beyond any statistical doubt. Fiber analysis connected materials found at the crime scene to items recovered from the Fucci residence. Soil samples from Aiden's shoes contained the same distinctive composition as the ground where Tristan's body was discovered. Each test added another thread to the web of evidence until the totality became impossible to dispute. The forensic case against Aiden Fucci was among the strongest investigators had ever assembled. There were no gaps, no ambiguities, no alternative explanations that could account for what the science revealed. The physical world itself had recorded his guilt in blood and DNA and trace materials. The digital evidence proved equally damning when subjected to forensic analysis. Specialists recovered deleted files and hidden data from Aiden's devices, uncovering a history of violent imagery and disturbing searches that predated the murder. His interest in gore and death was not a recent development but a long-standing pattern documented across multiple platforms. The Snapchat records alone provided a window into a mind that seemed incapable of remorse. Beyond the infamous selfie in the patrol car, investigators found messages that suggested Aiden viewed the killing as an accomplishment rather than a tragedy. His casual references to violence in the hours after murdering Tristan demonstrated a disconnect from normal human emotion that experts would later cite as evidence of deep psychological pathology. Cell phone location data mapped Aiden's movements on the night of the murder with precision that eliminated any remaining doubt about his whereabouts. The technology tracked his device as it traveled from the friend's house along North Durban Parkway into the wooded area where Tristan died and back to his home on Castledale Court. The timeline established by this data aligned perfectly with the surveillance footage, creating a redundant confirmation of events that no defense could explain away. Modern investigative tools had captured a murder in granular detail, from the first steps into the darkness to the final attempt at concealment. Aiden Fucci had committed his crime in an era when digital footprints were nearly impossible to erase. His mother's attempts to protect him only deepened the evidence against them both. Surveillance footage from inside the Fucci home showed Crystal Smith retrieving the bloody jeans from Aiden's room and scrubbing them in the bathroom sink. She performed this cleanup while Tristan was still officially listed as a missing child, before the body had been discovered, before any charges had been filed. Her actions suggested foreknowledge of what her son had done and a willful decision to help him escape accountability. When investigators analyzed the sink drain and found traces of blood that matched Tristan's DNA, the case against Crystal Smith became clear. She had not merely failed to report her son's crime, she had actively participated in concealing it. The arrest of Aiden Fucci in the early hours of May 10th marked only the beginning of a legal process that would stretch across nearly 2 years of motions, hearings, and psychiatric evaluations. The boy who had smiled in the back of a patrol car would eventually face a courtroom filled with people demanding answers he seemed incapable of providing. The initial court appearance came on May 11, 2021, just 1 day after Aiden Fucci's arrest. He appeared via video link from the Volusia Regional Juvenile Detention Center, where he had been transported following his booking. The proceedings were brief and procedural, focused on establishing probable cause and setting the conditions of his continued detention. A judge found sufficient evidence to hold Fucci on second-degree murder charges, ordering him to remain in custody for at least 21 days while prosecutors determined whether to pursue adult charges. The 14-year-old on the screen bore little resemblance to the smirking teenager who had posted selfies from a patrol car. He sat quietly, his expression difficult to read, as attorneys discussed his future in clinical legal terms. The contrast between his apparent composure in court and his documented callousness in the hours after the murder raised questions about what truly lurked beneath his carefully managed exterior. The question of whether to try Aiden Fucci as an adult generated significant public debate in the weeks following his arrest. Florida law gave prosecutors discretion in such matters, allowing them to consider the severity of the crime, the defendant's history, and the likelihood of rehabilitation when deciding whether a juvenile should face adult consequences. State Attorney R.J. Larizza did not deliberate long. On May 25, 2021, he announced that Fucci would be charged with first-degree premeditated murder and prosecuted as an adult. The decision meant that Fucci faced a potential sentence of life in prison, the maximum penalty available since Florida law prohibited executing defendants for crimes committed before their 18th birthday. Larizza's press conference drew national media attention as he explained the reasoning behind his decision. The premeditation was unmistakable, he said. The brutality was extraordinary, and the evidence that Fucci had planned this killing, had told friends it was coming, had fantasized about it for months, left no room for the leniency sometimes extended to juvenile offenders. The nearly 2 years between Fucci's arrest and his eventual day of reckoning were marked by legal maneuvering, psychiatric evaluations, and behavior that reinforced the prosecution's characterization of him him as beyond rehabilitation. Housed initially at a juvenile facility and later transferred to the Duval County Jail because St. Johns County lacked appropriate juvenile housing, Fucci proved to be a disruptive and dangerous presence. Jail incident reports documented a pattern of misconduct that painted a troubling picture of a teenager who had learned nothing from his circumstances. He extorted commissary items from other inmates. He threatened to kill fellow detainees who challenged him. He made violent threats against corrections officers and their families. On at least 2 occasions, guards were forced to pepper spray him to regain control of situations he had escalated. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of Fucci boasting about his crime to other inmates. According to jail records, he bragged that he was tougher than teenagers who had killed their victims with guns because he had stabbed a girl face to face. The statement revealed a perverse pride in the intimacy of his violence, a sense that the close-quarters brutality of his attack somehow elevated him above other killers. Rather than expressing remorse or grappling with the enormity of what he had done, Fucci seemed to view his crime as an achievement that established his place in the jail's hierarchy. The reports of this behavior would eventually reach prosecutors, adding another layer of evidence to their argument that Aiden Fucci was beyond saving. His courtroom appearances during the pretrial period occasionally offered glimpses of something deeply wrong beneath the surface. At a hearing in September 2021, conducted via video link due to ongoing pandemic restrictions, Fucci's behavior became suddenly erratic. He began rocking back and forth in his chair, a rhythmic motion that drew concerned attention from his attorneys. He mumbled incoherently about demons. "Demons are going to take my soul away," he said, repeating the phrase multiple times. He asked where he was, seemingly disoriented, though he had participated in similar proceedings before. The episode raised questions about his mental state that defense attorneys would later attempt to use in arguing for leniency. Prosecutors viewed the performance more skeptically, noting that Fucci had shown no such confusion during his many calculated acts of manipulation and intimidation behind bars. The defense team, led by attorney Rosemarie Peoples, faced the unenviable task of crafting an argument for mercy in the face of overwhelming evidence. They commissioned psychological evaluations and gathered documentation of Fucci's troubled background. The ADHD diagnosis was examined for its potential role in impulsive behavior. Family history of mental illness was cataloged and presented as context for his psychological development. Allegations of abuse by a stepfather were introduced to suggest that Fucci himself had been victimized before becoming a victimizer. The defense would argue that a child failed by every system meant to protect him could not be held to the same standard as an adult who chose evil freely. Whether this argument could generate sympathy for a boy who had stabbed a cheerleader 114 times remained deeply uncertain. As months stretched into a year and then beyond, the Bailey family waited for justice with patience that would later draw commendation from the judge himself. They attended hearings when possible, their presence a silent reminder of what had been taken from them. They avoided making public statements that might compromise the prosecution's case, channeling their grief into private mourning while the legal process ground forward. Community support remained strong throughout the extended pre-trial period, with aqua ribbons still visible on porches and mailboxes throughout Durbin Crossing. The neighborhood that had lost Tristan Bailey refused to forget her, even as the machinery of justice moved at its own deliberate pace. The trial was scheduled to begin in February 2023, nearly 2 years after Mother's Day 2021. Jury selection was set to commence on February 6th, with opening statements expected to follow within days. The Bailey family prepared themselves for the ordeal of hearing every detail of their daughter's death, resented in open court. But Aiden Fucci had one more surprise left to deliver. February 6, 2023, dawned with the expectation of a lengthy and emotionally grueling trial. Attorneys on both sides had prepared for weeks of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal argument. The Bailey family had steeled themselves for the ordeal of hearing every detail of Tristan's murder recounted in clinical courtroom language. Jury selection was scheduled to begin that morning, the first step in a process that would determine whether Aiden Fucci would spend his life behind bars. cars. The St. Johns County Courthouse buzzed with the energy that accompanies high-profile criminal proceedings. Media crews set up outside. Spectators lined up for the limited public seating. Everyone anticipated a trial that would captivate the nation and force a community to relive its darkest day. No one anticipated what happened instead. When Aiden Fucci entered the courtroom that morning, he looked much as he had in previous appearances. Now 16 years old, he wore the red jumpsuit assigned to inmates in his custody classification. His expression betrayed little of what churned beneath the surface. The proceeding began with routine preliminary matters, the legal housekeeping that precedes jury selection in any criminal case. But before the first potential juror could be called, Fucci's attorney rose to address the court. What followed stunned everyone in the room. Aiden Fucci wished to change his plea. He would plead guilty to first-degree murder in the death of Tristan Bailey. There would be no trial. There would be no jury deliberation. The boy who had smiled in the back of a patrol car and proclaimed his imminent return home was now admitting to everything. The guilty plea eliminated the need for a trial but did not end the legal proceedings. Under Florida law, first-degree murder carried a sentencing range from a minimum of 40 years to a maximum of life imprisonment. Because Fucci was a juvenile at the time of the crime, he was ineligible for the death penalty, but life in prison remained very much on the table. Judge R. Lee Smith, who had presided over the case since its earliest stages, scheduled a sentencing hearing for the following month. The hearing would give both sides the opportunity to present evidence and arguments relevant to the appropriate punishment. For the prosecution, this meant demonstrating the premeditation, brutality, and lack of remorse that justified the maximum sentence. For the defense, it meant marshaling every mitigating factor that might persuade the judge to show mercy. The sentencing hearing commenced on March 21, 2023, in a St. Johns County courtroom packed beyond comfortable capacity. More than 50 supporters of the Bailey family filled the gallery, many wearing aqua clothing or ribbons in tribute to Tristan. The atmosphere was heavy with grief and anticipation, the weight of nearly 2 years of waiting finally reaching its conclusion. Judge Smith had made clear that he would hear extensive testimony before rendering his decision. Both sides had prepared witness lists that promised hours of emotional and forensic evidence. The prosecution intended to leave no doubt about the horror of what Aiden Fucci had done. The defense hoped to humanize a teenager they believed was salvageable despite his monstrous act. Sergeant Kurt Hannon took the stand as one of the prosecution's first witnesses, walking the court through the investigation he had led from its earliest hours. His testimony established the timeline that surveillance footage had captured: 2 teenagers walking together toward this. E. Woods, one teenager emerging alone. He described the evidence recovered from the Fucci residence, the bloody clothing and the knife sheath, and the traces of violence that cleanup efforts had failed to eliminate. Perhaps most powerfully, he recounted Aiden's behavior during the initial investigation, the Snapchat selfie that mocked a community's desperate search, the response of, "How is that my problem?" when informed of Tristan's death. The lead investigator's calm recitation of facts carried an emotional weight that no dramatic flourish could have enhanced. The court then heard testimony regarding the digital evidence that had proven so damning. Prosecutors presented the Snapchat videos and photographs that Aiden had posted while sitting in the back of a patrol car, material that had never before been shown publicly. The footage revealed a teenager utterly detached from the reality of what he had done. "We're having fun in a effing cop car," Aiden could be heard saying in one clip, his voice carrying a note of amusement that seemed impossible given the circumstances. The selfie with the peace sign and the mocking caption about Tristan's whereabouts took on even greater horror when viewed in the context of what investigators knew at the time. While search parties combed the neighborhood and a family prayed for their daughter's safe return, her killer was treating the whole situation as entertainment. Dr. James Fulcher, the chief medical examiner who had conducted Tristan's autopsy, provided clinical testimony about the injuries she had sustained. He described the 114 stab wounds with the precision his profession demanded, cataloging their locations, depths, and characteristics. He explained the significance of the 49 defensive wounds, evidence that Tristan had fought desperately desperately against an attacker she could not escape. He detailed the knee tip found lodged in her skull, the force required to break a blade in such fashion, the sustained violence implied by the pattern of injuries. His testimony translated the horror of the crime scene into medical language, but the underlying reality was no less devastating for its clinical presentation. The forensic evidence painted a picture of suffering that no one in the courtroom could ignore. Each wound represented a separate act of violence, a distinct choice to continue attacking a girl who was already dying. The defensive injuries meant Tristan remained conscious and aware through much of the assault, fighting for a life that was being stolen one stab at a time. Judge Smith listened intently as expert after expert confirmed what the physical evidence had already proven beyond doubt. Aiden Fucci had not merely killed Tristan Bailey, he had subjected her to an ordeal of terror and pain that lasted far longer than any child should ever have to endure. Dr. Gregory Pritchard, a licensed clinical psychologist, took the stand to provide insight into the mind of the teenager who had committed this crime. His testimony drew from extensive interviews with Aiden Fucci, his family members, and those who had known him before the murder. Pritchard described a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond normal adolescent boundary testing. Aiden had demonstrated what the psychologist termed an unusual fascination with gore and violence, an interest that had intensified over time rather than fading. He had talked about death and killing constantly, making it a centerpiece of his conversations with peers. He had watched videos depicting real violence, not the fictional gore of horror films, but actual footage of people suffering. The clinical picture that emerged was of a teenager whose relationship with violence was not performative edginess, but genuine obsession. The psychologist's most disturbing revelations came from his interview with Aiden's ex-girlfriend. She had described a relationship marked by behavior that should have triggered alarm, but was instead dismissed as dark humor between teenagers who considered themselves different. Aiden would take out his knife and pretend to stab her. He would come up behind her and hold the blade against her throat, mimicking the motion of slitting it, while she laughed nervously. He told her how easy it would be to kill her while she slept, describing the scenario with a specificity that suggested he had thought carefully about it. He announced that he was going to kill someone soon and that she should expect it to happen within the month. Every warning sign had been present. Every declaration of intent had been made, and no one had taken him seriously until Tristan Bailey lay dead in the woods. Pritchard offered his professional assessment of Fucci's potential for rehabilitation, and his conclusions were grim. The behavior Aiden had displayed after the killing, from the selfies in the patrol car to the boasting in jail, demonstrated what the psychologist described as callousness, incompatible with meaningful change. The lack of remorse was not a temporary coping mechanism, but appeared to reflect a fundamental absence of empathy. Pritchard testified that Fucci's behavior was so unusual compared to individuals his age that there was a poor prognosis for rehabilitation. The words hung in the courtroom air, clinical language that translated into a devastating reality. The experts who had examined Aiden Fucci most closely had concluded that the 14-year-old who killed Tristan Bailey was unlikely to ever become anything other than a danger to those around him. Then came the victim impact statements, and the courtroom's atmosphere shifted from clinical assessment to raw human grief. The Bailey family had waited nearly 2 years for this moment, the opportunity to address the court and speak directly about what had been taken from them. They had prepared their words with care, knowing that this might be their only chance to ensure the judge understood the full measure of their loss. What followed over the next several hours would leave no one in the room unchanged. The proceedings transformed from a legal hearing into a memorial, a collective act of remembrance for a 13-year-old girl who had deserved so much more than the fate she received. Alexis Bailey, Tristan's older sister, approached the witness stand first. She carried with her an empty glass jar and a collection of small stone hearts, each one colored in the aqua shade that had become synonymous with Tristan's memory. Without speaking, Alexis began to drop the stones into the jar one by one. The sound of each stone hitting glass echoed through the silent courtroom. 1, 2, 3. The count continued as everyone watched, matched, the rhythm hypnotic in its relentlessness. 20, 30, 40. Each stone represented a wound inflicted on her baby sister's body. 50, 60, 70. The jar began to fill, the accumulated stones creating a visual representation of violence that statistics alone could never convey. 80, 90, 100. Still the stones kept falling. The process took nearly 2 minutes. 2 minutes of unbroken silence punctuated only by the click of stone against glass. When the final stone fell, Alexis spoke for the first time. "This jar now holds 114 stones," she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. 114 stab wounds. The jar remained on the witness stand throughout the remaining testimony, a physical reminder of what had been done to Tristan. Each subsequent family member would add a single white stone at the conclusion of their statement, representing something specific that Aiden Fucci had taken from them. The ritual transformed individual grief into collective testimony, building a monument to loss that no words alone could have constructed. Alexis continued her statement, describing the sister she had loved and the void that would never be filled. "Aiden Fucci didn't just take Tristan's life that day," she said. "He took everything from us." The other siblings followed, each bringing their own perspective on the magnitude of their loss. Brother Tegan recalled driving Tristan home from cheerleading practice, spoiling her with Starbucks drinks, having conversations about goals and dreams that would now never be realized. Sister Brittany, who had been on her honeymoon when she learned Tristan was missing, described the agony of returning to a nightmare. "Shattered to the core doesn't crumble like how I feel," she told the court. "And let me tell you, justice is just a word for comfort. It doesn't bring her back." Both sisters disclosed that they suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the murder, their mental health permanently scarred by violence they had not witnessed but could not escape. Stacy Bailey, Tristan's mother, approached the witness stand carrying the weight of every parent's worst nightmare. She had spent nearly 2 years waiting for this moment, the chance to speak directly to the court about her daughter and the boy who had murdered her. Her testimony began with memories of the child she had raised, the cheerleader who had shared so many weekends at competitions, the youngest of her 5 children who had filled their home with laughter and energy. But as she continued, her words turned toward the devastation that Aiden Fucci had wrought upon her family. She described the nightmares that now haunted her sleep, visions of her daughter's final moments that she could not escape no matter how she tried. She spoke of the chronic anxiety that had caused her hair to fall out and break, physical manifestations of grief that her body could not contain. "Aiden Fucci, you have destroyed me," Stacy said, turning to look directly at the teenager in the red jumpsuit. "You have destroyed my family." Her voice cracked but did not break as she addressed her daughter's killer with the full force of a mother's anguish. She recalled the Mother's Day morning when she had expected to celebrate with all 5 of her children, only to discover that her youngest was gone. She described the hours of searching, the growing terror, the moment when hope finally died. "I did not know that I needed to teach Tristan to be afraid of the evil in her own school," she told the court, "to be cautious and fearful of the people you think are your friends. Aiden Fucci, you betrayed us all." When she concluded her statement, she added a white stone to the jar her daughter Alexis had filled, this one representing the future she would never share with her baby girl. Stacy's plea to Judge Smith was unambiguous and absolute. "Please do not for 1 second think that he could be rehabilitated at any point," she said, her voice steady with conviction. "He is beyond saving." The words echoed the clinical assessment Dr. Pritchard had offered, but they carried a different weight coming from the mother of the victim. This was not a professional opinion based on interviews and psychological evaluations. This was the judgment of a woman who had looked into the face of the boy who stabbed her daughter 114 times and seen nothing that deserved mercy. She asked for the maximum sentence, life in prison, and made clear that anything less would constitute a failure of justice for Tristan. Forrest Bailey, the patriarch of the Bailey Seven, took his turn at the witness stand with a composure that masked unimaginable pain. He had supported his wife and children through every moment of the nearly 2-year ordeal, a steady presence amid chaos and grief. His testimony focused less on his own suffering and more on the daughter he had lost, the bright spirit who had made their family complete. He spoke of Tristan's Tristan's determination, her kindness, her way of making everyone around her feel valued. He described the pride he felt watching her compete in cheerleading, the joy of seeing her win championships, the ordinary moments that had seemed so unremarkable until they were gone forever. Unlike his wife, Forrest did not address Aiden Fucci directly. He spoke instead to the judge and to the memory of his daughter, honoring her with his words, even as he mourned her with his heart. Teachers and coaches who had known Tristan added their voices to the chorus of grief. A representative from Patriot Oaks Academy described the student who had lit up classrooms with her enthusiasm and kindness. Tristan's cheerleading coaches recalled an athlete whose dedication exceeded her years, whose competitive spirit was matched only by her generosity toward teammates. Friends of the Bailey family testified about the ripple effects of the murder, the way it had shattered not just one family but an entire community. Each witness added another dimension to the portrait of what had been lost, transforming Tristan from a name in a case file into a fully realized human being whose absence left an unfillable void. The prosecution also called witnesses who could speak to Aiden Fucci's behavior in the time since his arrest. Jail officials described the incident reports that had accumulated during his pretrial detention, the threats against inmates and guards, the boasting about his crime, the utter absence of remorse. The testimony reinforced what the psychological evaluation had suggested. Aiden Fucci was not a troubled teenager who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of passion. He was something else entirely, something that showed no signs of changes, regardless of consequences or interventions. The picture that emerged was of a young man who viewed his imprisonment as an inconvenience rather than a consequence, who wore his notoriety as a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. Only one person came to speak on Aiden Fucci's behalf, and her testimony carried its own kind of tragedy. Deborah Spiewak, Fucci's grandmother, took the stand with tears already flowing down her cheeks. She addressed the court with a grandmother's love, asking for mercy for a boy she had watched grow up, a child she still saw beneath the monster the prosecution had described. "Please don't take him out of our lives forever," she pleaded with Judge Smith. "I know there is some good in Aiden." Her words hung in the air, a desperate attempt to find humanity in someone whose actions had demonstrated its absence. Judge Smith would later acknowledge the courage it took for her to testify, recognizing that she had faced a courtroom full of people who despised her grandson and spoken anyway. The defense had called few witnesses, and the contrast with the prosecution's extensive presentation was stark. They had no character witnesses willing to speak of Aiden's kindness, no teachers praising his potential, no friends describing the good they saw in him. Crystal Smith, his mother, did not appear in person, sending instead a letter that asked the court for mercy and insisted that her son was not beyond saving. Her attorney had advised her to stay away, likely because her own pending charges for evidence tampering made her presence problematic. The absence of family support in the courtroom spoke louder than any testimony could have. The closing arguments brought the sentencing hearing to its climax, each side making their final case for the fate of Aiden Fucci. Defense attorney Rosemary Peoples faced the unenviable task of arguing for leniency on behalf of a client whose crimes had shocked a nation. She did not attempt to minimize what Aiden had done or suggest that Tristan Bailey's death was anything other than a tragedy of the highest order. Instead, she focused on the factors that she believed should mitigate the punishment, the circumstances that had shaped the boy before he became a killer. Her argument was not that Aiden deserved mercy because he was innocent of cruelty, but that society bore some responsibility for failing to intervene before that cruelty found its ultimate expression. Peoples walked the court through Aiden's troubled history, building a narrative of a child failed at every turn. She cited his ADHD diagnosis and the challenges it created for emotional regulation and impulse control. She described the emotional neglect he had experienced during crucial developmental years, the absence of the nurturing support that children need to develop empathy and self-control. She referenced the family history of mental illness, suggesting that Aiden had inherited vulnerabilities that made him more susceptible to the darkness that eventually consumed him. Most significantly, she alleged that Aiden had suffered physical abuse at the hands of a stepfather, trauma that had warped his understanding of violence and and its consequences. None of these factors excused what he had done, Peoples acknowledged, but together they painted a picture of a boy who might have turned out differently under different circumstances. The defense attorney recommended a sentence of 40 years, the minimum allowed under Florida law for first-degree murder. She argued that this punishment would still ensure Aiden spent the majority of his life behind bars, while acknowledging that a 14-year-old brain was not fully developed, that the capacity for change existed even in those who had committed terrible acts. Peoples pointed to research on adolescent brain development, studies showing that the prefrontal cortex responsible for judgment and impulse control does not fully mature until the mid-20s. She suggested that writing off a teenager as permanently irredeemable ignored the science of human development. Her argument was a last-ditch effort to find some sliver of hope in a case defined by hopelessness. State Attorney Jennifer Dunton rose to deliver the prosecution's closing with the weight of evidence and emotion firmly on her side. She began by recounting Aiden's impetuous behavior, the pattern of misconduct that had characterized his time in custody. She detailed the disciplinary problems at school that had preceded the murder, the warning signs that peers and adults alike had failed to recognize. She reminded the court of the verbalization that had occurred beforehand, the multiple friends and girlfriends to whom Aiden had announced his intention to kill. He had told his girlfriend it would happen soon. He had said they should expect it within the month. He had described exactly how he would do it: find someone walking at night, drag them into the woods, and stab them. This was not a crime of passion or impulse. This was a crime he had planned, anticipated, and ultimately executed exactly as he had described. Dunton's voice rose as she described the nature of the attack itself: 114 stab wounds, 49 defensive injuries, a knife tip broken off in the victim's skull. Tristan Bailey had fought for her life with every ounce of strength her 13-year-old body possessed, and her killer had simply continued stabbing until his blade literally broke apart. This crime was extremely unique and extremely violent, Dunton told the court. She cited Dr. Pritchard's testimony, the clinical psychologist's conclusion that Aiden understood right from wrong, that he was aware of the consequences of his actions, that his behavior demonstrated a poor prognosis for rehabilitation. The prosecution's position was unequivocal. Life in prison was the only appropriate sentence for a crime of such calculated brutality. The matter of Aiden Fucci's own words to the court remained to be addressed. He had written a letter that was read into the record, an attempt at apology that the Bailey family immediately rejected as insincere. "I'm sorry for all the pain I caused to the Bailey family," the letter read. "I'm sorry to the friends, brothers, sisters, mom, dad, and any other family relatives. I'm sorry that you didn't get to know her that long." Forrest Bailey later described the letter as coached, the words of attorneys rather than genuine remorse. The apology rang hollow, coming from someone who had spent his time in custody boasting about his crime and threatening those around him. If Aiden Fucci felt remorse, his behavior provided no evidence of it. Crystal Smith's letter to the court struck a different tone, pleading for mercy for her son while insisting that rehabilitation remained possible. "He is not beyond saving," she wrote, directly contradicting the assessment of the victim's mother and the clinical psychologist alike. But Crystal Smith had forfeited much of her credibility through her own actions on the night of the murder, the evidence tampering that had resulted in criminal charges against her. Her absence from the courtroom spoke to the complexity of her situation, a mother who loved her son but had made choices that deepened rather than diminished his culpability. The letter was entered into the record, but its impact on Judge Smith's deliberations remained unclear. As the final arguments concluded and the courtroom fell silent, all eyes turned to the bench where Judge R. Lee Smith would render his decision. The Bailey family held hands, their supporters gathered close, their hearts suspended between grief and hope. Aiden Fucci sat expressionless at the defense table, his future now entirely in the hands of a man he had never met before this case began. Nearly 2 years of Whitey's had come down to this single moment. Judge R. Lee Smith took his time before delivering his decision, the weight of the moment evident in his measured approach. He had presided over countless cases during his career on the bench, but nothing had prepared him for this one. A 14-year-old defendant, a 13-year-old 14-year-old victim, 114 stab wounds, a community shattered. The sentencing hearing had stretched across 3 days of testimony, evidence, and argument, and now the responsibility of rendering judgment fell entirely upon his shoulders. When he finally began to speak, his voice carried the gravity of someone who understood that his words would echo far beyond this courtroom, far beyond this county, far beyond this single case. This case is probably the most difficult and shocking case that this county, St. Johns County, has dealt with, Judge Smith began. His assessment was not hyperbole. St. Johns County had long been considered one of the safest jurisdictions in Florida, a place where violent crime was rare and murder almost unheard of. The killing of Tristan Bailey had shattered that reputation and forced an entire community to confront the reality that evil could emerge from within their own homes, their own schools, their own neighborhood streets. The judge acknowledged the unprecedented nature of what had occurred, the way it had transformed Durbin Crossing from an idyllic suburb into a crime scene that would never fully heal. Smith then walked through the factors he had considered in reaching his decision, demonstrating the careful deliberation that the law required. He acknowledged Aiden Fucci's young age, a factor that weighed in favor of leniency under legal precedent and developmental science, but he balanced this against the heightened level of premeditation the evidence had revealed. Aiden had not killed in a moment of passion or impulse. He had announced his intentions to multiple people. He had described exactly how he would commit the murder. He had Karsh's Ida knife specifically for this purpose. The crime was not an aberration but a culmination, the final expression of fantasies he had nurtured for months or perhaps years. Smith noted that Fucci was the sole participant in the murder, acting without pressure or coercion from others. This was his choice alone. The judge addressed the psychological testimony directly, citing Dr. Pritchard's assessment that Aiden was of average maturity for his age and understood the consequences of his actions. There was no cognitive impairment that prevented him from knowing right from wrong. There was no psychotic break that detached him from reality. He had killed Tristan Bailey with full awareness of what he was doing and full understanding of what it meant. Smith referenced the expert's conclusion about the poor prognosis for rehabilitation, the clinical judgment that Aiden's behavior was so unusual compared to other juveniles that meaningful change was unlikely. The callousness demonstrated after the killing, from the Snapchat selfies to the jailhouse boasting, reinforced this assessment. This crime was heinous, atrocious, and cruel, Judge Smith declared, using legal terminology that carried specific weight in Florida sentencing law. He described Tristan's injuries in detail, the 49 defensive wounds that proved she had fought for her life, the knife tip embedded in her skull that testified to the violence required to break the blade. He spoke of her suffering, the terror she must have experienced as someone she knew attacked her repeatedly in the darkness of those woods. The attack had not been swift or merciful. It had been prolonged and savage, continuing long past the point when death was assured. The brutality was not incidental to the crime, but central to it, suggesting that Aiden Fucci had derived something from the act of killing that he could not obtain any other way. Then came the statement that would define this case in the years to follow. This crime had no motive, Judge Smith said, his voice heavy with the implications of those words. This was not done out of greed. It was not done in retaliation or retribution or revenge. It was not a crime of passion. He paused, allowing the silence to underscore what came next. It was done for no other reason than to satisfy this defendant's internal desire to feel what it was like to kill someone. The judge had arrived at the same conclusion the evidence had pointed toward all along. Aiden Fucci had murdered Tristan Bailey because he wanted to know what murder felt like. She had not been a target of hatred or a victim of circumstance. She had simply been available, trusting, and vulnerable. Her death was an experiment conducted by a boy who wanted to experience the act of taking a life. "There is only one appropriate sentence," Judge Smith announced. The courtroom held its collective breath. In the front row, Stacy Bailey gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Behind them, more than 50 supporters leaned forward, waiting for the words they had prayed would come. At the defense table, Aiden Fucci sat motionless, his expression revealing nothing of whatever thoughts moved carved behind his eyes. The judge looked directly at the defendant as he delivered his verdict. The court sentences you to life in prison, the maximum penalty. No possibility of release except through a review process that would not occur for 25 years. Aiden Fucci would grow old behind bars, would spend his youth and middle age in a cell, would likely die in the custody of the Florida Department of Corrections. Justice, at last, had been served. The moment the words left Judge Smith's mouth, the courtroom erupted in a wave of emotion that had been building for nearly 2 years. Stacy Bailey collapsed into her husband's arms, sobbing with a grief that was equal parts relief and renewed anguish. The sentence would not bring Tristan back. Nothing could bring Tristan back. But the boy who had stolen her daughter's life would never walk free again, would never have the opportunity to do to another family what he had done to hers. Around them, supporters wept openly, embracing one another as the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. Some whispered prayers of gratitude. Others simply sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that justice had finally arrived after so many months of waiting. Judge Smith was not finished speaking. He turned his attention to the Bailey family, addressing them directly with words that acknowledged both their suffering and their conduct throughout the proceedings. "The loss which you have clearly suffered is unimaginable," he said, his voice softening from the formal tone of sentencing. He praised Forrest Bailey specifically for his patience with the court process, recognizing the restraint the family had shown during nearly 2 years of delays and hearings. The judge understood that they had been asked to endure the unendurable, to sit quietly while attorneys argued over the fate of their daughter's killer, to trust that the system would ultimately deliver justice. They had done so with dignity that commanded respect. Sometimes family members hope or expect that whatever the sentence is, that somehow or another that's going to heal or provide closure, Judge Smith continued. His words carried the wisdom of someone who had witnessed countless families seek solace in verdicts and sentences, only to discover that legal resolution could not mend broken hearts. "I cannot provide closure to this," he admitted. "It may close a chapter, but I cannot bring her back." The honesty was both brutal and necessary, a reminder that the criminal justice system could punish the guilty, but could never restore what they had taken. He encouraged the family to continue healing, to find ways to honor Tristan's memory, to allow Bailey Sunday Fundays to return to their home because their daughter would have wanted them to experience joy again. The judge also acknowledged the courage of Deborah Spiewak, Aiden's grandmother, who had testified on behalf of a grandson reviled by everyone else in the room. "That took a lot of courage," Smith said. "That was not easy for her." The recognition was unexpected but fitting, a reminder that the tragedy of this case extended beyond the Bailey family. Somewhere, a grandmother loved a monster, and she had stood before a hostile courtroom to plead for his life. Her testimony had not changed the outcome, but the judge respected her willingness to face the anger of a community and speak anyway. It was a small moment of grace in proceedings otherwise defined by horror and grief. Aiden Fucci showed little visible reaction as the sentence was announced. He sat at the defense table in his red prison jumpsuit, his expression as unreadable as it had been throughout the hearing. There were no tears, no outbursts, no dramatic collapse of the arrogance that had characterized his behavior since the night of the murder. Whether this composure reflected genuine indifference or careful emotional control remained impossible to determine. When guards approached to lead him from the courtroom, he rose without resistance and walked toward the door that would take him to a life behind bars. He did not look back at his grandmother, the only family member who had come to speak for him. He did not glance toward the Bailey family, whose lives he had destroyed. He simply walked, a 16-year-old boy who would grow into middle age and old age without ever experiencing freedom again. The departure of Aiden Fucci from the courtroom marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For the Bailey family, the work of healing could now continue without the shadow of an impending trial hanging over them. Forrest Bailey stepped forward to address the media gathered outside the courthouse, speaking on behalf of his family with characteristic grace. "Tristan, I wanted to let you know we are so extremely proud of the person that you were in your time here," he said, directing his words to the daughter who could no longer hear them. "When you went out into the world, you gave it your very best. You should be proud of the friend that you were, the teammate you were, and what you left behind." His message was for Tristan, but it also reminded everyone listening of who the true victim was in this case. Forrest expressed gratitude for the sentence while acknowledging its limitations. "We are very appreciative of this outcome and felt that it is the right verdict, considering how heinous the crime is and Aiden's behavior around it," he said. But then he offered something unexpected, a gesture of compassion that transcended the bitterness anyone would have understood. He asked the public not to mistreat Aiden Fucci's family, recognizing that they too were suffering in their own way. "Please extend them kindness," Forrest said. "They should be given grace for the pain they're going through. They should not be given additional hardship." The words were remarkable, coming from a man whose daughter had been stabbed 114 times by the son of the woman he was defending. The sentence would be subject to review in 25 years, a requirement under Florida law for juvenile offenders sentenced to life in prison. In 2048, Aiden Fucci would appear before a court to have his case evaluated to demonstrate whether the rehabilitation experts had deemed impossible had somehow occurred. The Bailey family vowed to be present for that hearing to ensure that the man who had killed their daughter and sister remained exactly where he belonged. But that fight lay decades in the future. For now, they had achieved what they came for. Justice had been served. Tristan Bailey's killer would spend his life in prison, and perhaps, finally, the healing could truly begin. The aftermath of the sentencing brought its own form of justice to those who had aided Aiden Fucci in his attempt to escape accountability. Crystal Smith, his mother, had avoided the courtroom during her son's sentencing hearing, but she could not avoid the consequences of her own actions forever. The evidence tampering charge stemming from her decision to wash blood from Aiden's jeans on the night of the murder had hung over her for nearly 2 years. Surveillance footage from inside her own home had captured her retrieving the bloody clothing from her son's room and scrubbing it in the bathroom sink. She had done this while Tristan was still listed as a missing child, before the body had been discovered, before she could claim ignorance of what had occurred. Her actions spoke to a mother willing to help her child evade justice for murder. On May 12, 2023, less than 2 months after her son received his life sentence, Crystal Smith appeared in the same St. Johns County courthouse to face her own reckoning. She changed her plea from not guilty to no contest on the charge of tampering with evidence, a third-degree felony that carried a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison. The plea deal, negotiated by her attorneys, resulted in a sentence of 30 days in the St. Johns County Jail, followed by 5 years of probation. It was a lenient outcome compared to what she could have faced, but State Attorney R.J. Larizza made clear his view of her conduct. "What the defendant did was not protecting her child," he said. "She was assisting him in avoiding responsibility for an extraordinarily vicious and merciless crime." Stacey Bailey, Tristan's mother, delivered a victim impact statement at Crystal Smith's sentencing that reflected the ongoing torment the case had inflicted. "The choices you made on Mother's Day 2021 will haunt me for the rest of my life," she told the woman who had tried to help cover up her daughter's murder. "The irreparable damage that you have caused by your actions will forever be etched into our lives." The statement was brief but devastating, a reminder that Crystal Smith's attempt to protect her son had compounded the trauma experienced by a family already suffering beyond imagination. When Smith was led away to begin her 30-day jail sentence, it marked another small victory for justice in a case that had demanded so much patience from everyone seeking it. Aiden Fucci's journey through the Florida Department of Corrections began immediately after his sentencing. He was transferred from the Duval County Jail, where he had been held during the pre-trial period, to the state prison system that would now be his home for life. His initial placement was at Suwannee Correctional Institution in Live Oak, a facility that housed adult inmates despite his young age. The decision to try him as an adult meant he would serve his sentence among grown men, many of whom had committed violent crimes of their own. The boy who had boasted about being tougher than other teenage killers would now have to survive in an environment where such claims could be tested by inmates with nothing left to lose. Reports from his early months in prison suggested that the transition was not smooth. On June 5, 2023, barely 3 months after his sentencing, Fucci was involved in a fight that resulted in a disciplinary notation in his record. The incident did not carry punitive punitive measures or result in solitary confinement, but it established a pattern that corrections officials would continue to monitor. The threats and intimidation that had characterized his behavior in the county jail apparently continued behind state prison walls. Guards remained wary of an inmate who had demonstrated both the capacity for extreme violence and the psychological detachment to feel no remorse about it. Aiden Fucci was 18 years old, serving a life sentence, and showing no signs of the rehabilitation his grandmother had hoped was possible. The community of Durbin Crossing, meanwhile, began the long process of returning to something resembling normalcy. The aqua ribbons that had adorned mailboxes and porches in the weeks after Tristan's death remained visible throughout the neighborhood, fading with time but never entirely disappearing. Parents who had been forced to have difficult conversations with their children about the murder now faced the ongoing challenge of helping those children process what had happened in their midst. The trails and wooded areas where teenagers had once gathered freely took on a different character, shadowed by the knowledge of what had occurred in that retention pond clearing. Some families moved away, unable to continue living in a place so marked by tragedy. Others stayed, determined not to let violence define their community. Annual vigils and memorial events kept Tristan's memory alive in the years following the sentencing. Her cheerleading teams retired her jersey number and established traditions honoring her competitive spirit and generous heart. The hashtag Bailey, strong movement that had emerged in the immediate aftermath of her death, evolved into an ongoing campaign promoting kindness and community connection. Aqua became more than just Tristan's favorite color. It became a symbol of resilience, of refusing to let darkness have the final word. The Bailey family channeled their grief into advocacy, speaking publicly about their daughter's life and legacy while encouraging parents to pay closer attention to warning signs in their own children. The case continued to generate media attention long after the courtroom proceedings concluded. Documentary filmmakers and true crime podcasters examined every detail, drawn by the shocking nature of the crime and the questions it raised about juvenile violence, parental responsibility, and the limits of rehabilitation. In 2025, the case was featured in the Netflix documentary series TikTok: Murder Gone Viral, which explored how social media had amplified both the crime and its aftermath. The Snapchat selfie that Aiden had posted from the back of a patrol car became an iconic image of youthful sociopathy, reproduced in countless articles and television segments analyzing what had gone so terribly wrong in the mind of a 14-year-old killer. 4 years after the murder that shattered Durbin Crossing, Aiden Fucci remains exactly where Judge R. Lee Smith determined he belonged. Now 18 years old, he has spent his formative teenage years behind bars, growing from a boy into a man within the confines of the Florida prison system. His appeals have failed. In 2024, his legal team challenged the life sentence, arguing various procedural and constitutional grounds for relief. The 5th District Court of Appeal reviewed the case thoroughly and found no merit to the arguments presented. The appellate court affirmed the trial court's decision in its entirety, noting that Fucci had lured the victim to a secluded place in the woods, stabbed her over 100 times, and inflicted 49 defensive wounds. The only modification to the original judgment was a minor clerical correction reducing a public defender application fee from $100 to the statutorily required $50. His life sentence stood untouched. The appellate ruling emphasized the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the appropriateness of the sentence given the circumstances. Under the Anders v. California standard, even Fucci's own appellate attorneys had difficulty identifying viable grounds for reversal, a tacit acknowledgement that the case against him was essentially unassailable. The court noted that Fucci had pleaded guilty, admitting to killing Tristan Bailey simply out of his desire to kill somebody and watch them die. With such an admission on the record, arguments about insufficient evidence or improper procedure carried little weight. The life sentence, with eligibility for review in 25 years, was exactly what Florida law prescribed for a crime of this magnitude committed by a juvenile. Aiden Fucci would remain imprisoned until at least 2048, when he would be 41 years old and facing a parole boa that would include Tristan Bailey Bailey's family among those arguing against his release. His journey through the prison system has included multiple transfers and ongoing behavioral challenges. After his initial placement at Suwannee Correctional Institution, Fucci was moved to the Reception and Medical Center West Unit in Lake Butler in January 2025. Corrections officials described the transfer as routine, part of a program reassignment rather than any medical necessity. A department spokesman confirmed that his only documented disciplinary issue at Suwannee was the single fighting incident in June 2023, which had not resulted in punitive measures. However, the pattern of threatening behavior that had characterized his time in the county jail apparently continued, albeit in forms that did not rise to the level of formal discipline. He was subsequently transferred again to Cross City Correctional Institution, where he is currently serving his sentence among the adult inmate population. The question of whether Aiden Fucci will ever demonstrate genuine rehabilitation remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The clinical psychologist who evaluated him before sentencing concluded that his prognosis was poor, that his behavior was so unusual compared to other juveniles that meaningful change was unlikely. Nothing in the years since has contradicted that assessment. The boasting, the threats, the complete absence of remorse that characterized his pre-trial detention have apparently continued behind prison walls. Guards and fellow inmates alike remain wary of a young man whose only claim to notoriety is the savage murder of a 13-year-old cheerleader. Whatever internal life Aiden Fucci possesses, whatever thoughts occupy his mind during the endless hours of incarceration, they remain hidden behind the same expressionless mask he wore throughout his court appearances. For the Bailey family, the years since sentencing have brought the slow, painful work of healing that Judge Smith had encouraged. They have channeled their grief into action, becoming advocates for victims' rights and vocal proponents of paying attention to warning signs in troubled youth. Stacey Bailey has spoken publicly about her daughter's life and death, using her platform to reach parents who might otherwise dismiss concerning behavior in their own children. The message is always the same. The signs were there with Aiden Fucci, visible to friends and girlfriends who did not understand what they were witnessing. Someone who talks constantly about killing, who practices with knives, who describes in detail how they would commit murder, should be taken seriously. Tristan might still be alive if anyone had connected the dots before it was too late. The community initiatives launched in Tristan's name have grown and evolved over the years. The #Bailey Strong movement continues to promote kindness and connection throughout St. Johns County and beyond. Local schools have implemented programs addressing violence prevention and mental health awareness, inspired at least in part by the tragedy that unfolded in their midst. Cheerleading organizations have established scholarships and awards honoring Tristan's memory, ensuring that her competitive spirit and generous heart continue to inspire young athletes. The aqua ribbons that once appeared spontaneously on porches and mailboxes have given way to more permanent memorials, plaques, and dedications that will outlast the fading fabric of those early tributes. The legal and psychological communities have also drawn lessons from this case. Experts studying juvenile violence cite Aiden Fucci as an example of how warning signs can be dismissed as teenage edginess, how statements of intent can be laughed off as dark humor, how the protective instincts of peers prevent them from reporting concerns to adults. The case appears in academic discussions about the limits of rehabilitation for certain categories of juvenile offenders, about the appropriate balance between accountability and developmental understanding. Researchers continue to analyze what went wrong in the systems meant to identify and intervene with troubled youth, hoping to prevent future tragedies by understanding how this one was allowed to occur. The murder of Tristan Bailey will be studied, analyzed, and debated for decades to come. It represents something that defies easy categorization, a crime committed not for money or revenge or passion, but simply because a 14-year-old boy wanted to know what killing felt like. Judge Smith's words echo through every discussion of the case. This crime had no motive. The absence of rational explanation is precisely what makes it so disturbing. We can understand, even if we condemn, crimes committed for comprehensible reasons. We can trace the path from cause to effect. effect, from provocation to response, from desire to action. But Aiden Fucci killed Tristan Bailey for no reason beyond his own curiosity about the experience of ending a life. She was not his enemy. She was not an obstacle to something he wanted. She was simply available, trusting, and vulnerable on a night when his long-festering fantasies finally demanded satisfaction. The philosophical questions raised by this case have no satisfying answers. How does a child become capable of such violence? What combination of nature and nurture produces a 14-year-old who stabs a classmate 114 times and then posts selfies mocking her disappearance? Were there interventions that could have changed the trajectory? Moments when adults might have recognized the danger and acted to prevent tragedy? Or was Aiden Fucci always destined to become what he became, his psychological makeup so fundamentally disordered that no amount of therapy or supervision could have contained the darkness within? These questions haunt parents who wonder if they truly know their own children, teachers who wonder if they missed warning signs in their own students, friends who wonder if the dark jokes they laughed off were actually confessions waiting to be heard. The warning signs in retrospect seem impossible to ignore. Multiple friends and girlfriends heard Aiden describe his desire to kill. They watched him practice stabbing motions with the knife he carried everywhere. They listened as he announced that murder was imminent, that it would happen within the month, that they should expect it. And they did nothing, not because they were negligent or uncaring, but because they could not reconcile what they heard with what they believed about the world. Teenagers say outrageous things. They push boundaries. They perform edginess for their peers. The friends who heard Aiden's declarations convinced themselves that he could not possibly mean what he was saying because accepting the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. Their failure to act was not moral weakness, but cognitive protection, the mind's refusal to believe that evil could wear such a familiar face. State Attorney R.J. Larizza's warning to parents has become a recurring theme in discussions of this case. You need to know what your kids are doing and what they are saying, he declared after announcing the first-degree murder charges. Because while we might not be able to stop these brutal and vicious murders from happening, we ought to at least try. The message is both simple and impossibly difficult. Parents cannot monitor every conversation their children have, cannot hear every dark joke whispered among friends, cannot read every message exchanged on social media platforms designed to evade adult oversight. But they can pay attention. They can ask questions. They can take seriously the concerns raised by teachers and counselors and other parents. They can recognize that "he's just a kid" is not an adequate response to behavior that would alarm them coming from an adult. Tristan Bailey deserved so much more than the fate she received. She deserved to finish 7th grade and move on to 8th. She deserved to compete in more cheerleading championships, to win more trophies, to feel the rush of performing before cheering crowds. She deserved high school and college and whatever career her talents and determination would have made possible. She deserved first loves and heartbreaks and the slow accumulation of experience that transforms children into adults. She deserved to grow old, surrounded by family, to become an aunt and perhaps a mother, to look back on a life fully lived. Instead, she died at 13 in a wooded clearing, fighting desperately against a classmate who had decided that her life was worth less than his curiosity about death. The injustice of it remains staggering no matter how many times the facts are recounted. But Tristan Bailey's legacy is not defined by how she died. It is defined by how she lived, by the kindness she showed to everyone around her, by the joy she brought to her family and friends, by the competitive fire that drove her to cheerleading championships. Her mother described her as a powerful child who gave so much to so many. Her siblings remember a sister who made ordinary moments feel special, who could relate to people of any age, who stood up for those who could not stand up for themselves. The #Bailey Strong movement carries forward her spirit of kindness and connection. The scholarships established in her name will help young cheerleaders pursue their dreams. The aqua ribbons that still appear in Durbin Crossing remind a community that one girl's light continues to shine even after it was so brutally extinguished. Aiden Fucci took Tristan Bailey's life on Mother's Day 2021. He took her future, her potential, her chance to become everything she was meant to be. He took a daughter from parents who adored her, a sister from siblings who cherished her, a friend from classmates who loved her. He took the sunshine from a family's mornings and the peace from a community's nights. But there are things he could not take, things that remain beyond the reach of even the most savage violence. He could not take the memories of those who knew her. He could not take the love that binds the Bailey Seven together. He could not take the impact she made during her 13 years of life. He could not take her legacy. Tristan Tyne Bailey was born on January 18, 2008 in Singapore. She died on May 9, 2021 in St. Johns County, Florida. In the years between, she lived with a fullness that many who reach old age never achieve. She loved fiercely. She competed passionately. She befriended generously. She smiled constantly. And though her time was cut impossibly short by an act of incomprehensible evil, she left behind something that her killer will never possess, a legacy of light that no darkness can extinguish. In Durban Crossing in St. Johns County, in the hearts of everyone who knew her story, Tristan Bailey lives on, always and forever.